So I'm going to just talk a little bit about brushes or the brush tool and how you can use it for touch-ups. And I'm also going to show you other ways of doing the same thing that I think is a slightly better way. But your brush tool is here, and B is the shortcut. And basically, if you just use it out the box, I'm just going to reset it here, it would do as you would expect it to do. It will basically brush on your layer and cover the pixels underneath. So the real power of the brush tool is actually in the settings up here, which is your blending mode. So if I set it to multiply, your opacity and your flow, which is basically how transparent and how much of that color is going to be released. So if I play around with that, you can see I get a much more subtle result. So I'll just undo that. So if you are using your brush and you wanted to, for example, change her eye color, you could use a brush, choose your eye color. I'll go for something like a teal. I will set my blending mode to overlay, and I'll set my opacity to 30 and the flow to 30. And now if I use a smallish brush and I paint over her eye, you can see that because I've chosen overlay and a lower opacity and flow, I'm able to retain all the detail in her eye, but just change the underlying color. That's quite an effective thing to do. So I'm going to revert this, and I'll come back to it in a moment. If a person has a dark iris to their eye, it's not as easy. So if I did the same thing here, I'm not going to get the same result. So in a case like this, you need to lighten the iris first, and you could do that with something like the dodge tool. Here it is, here, dodge tool, and set it on shadows and lighten up these areas first. Once you've lightened those areas, you can use your brush tool with those settings and you can change the color. I'm obviously doing a very crude job here. And now I've got a different eye color. So the brush tool is really something that you can use with these settings to touch up photos in a subtle way. If you're going to do something like change eye color, I'm going to just show you what I think is a better way of doing it. So I'll start with this one here, and that is to make a selection. So I'm going to choose Object Select and select the eye, and then go to my ellipse tool and put it on Subtract, and just subtract the pupil so that I now have the eye area. And obviously the more time you take with your selection, the better. And then I'm going to lift that into a new layer. So Control or Command J. I'm going to desaturate that. In other words, remove all the color. And then I can now apply hue and saturation. So adjustment, hue and saturation, and I'll set it to colorize, and the saturation will determine how strong that is. I don't want it to be too strong. And let's say I want it to have more of a golden look. Okay, so before and after. And with a darker eye, I would follow the same process. So I'm just going to take the ellipse tool. Okay, and then my lasso with Subtract, and subtract there. Okay, let me just zoom in a bit. Okay, and then I'm going to subtract the pupil, and also subtract this reflection. Okay, and then Control or Command J, so I now have that eye in its own layer. Now I can go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. I can lighten up that area and then I can go to image adjustments, hue and saturation, and I can colorize it and change to whatever color I want. Okay, so that to me is a better way of working because it's non-destructive and it actually gives you a better result. But the brush tool is pretty cool for applying touch-ups to images. There are loads of examples of that if you do a search on YouTube. But there's always more than one way of achieving something in Photoshop.